Well, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, has said the government are ready to draw up laws requiring minimum numbers of rail staff to work during a strike. The law would make any industrial action illegal if those levels were not met.
The announcement comes as a ballot of 40,000 union members across 16 rail networks are due to close on Tuesday. The General Secretary of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union has warned that a strike would bring the country to a standstill in what has been predicted to be the biggest rail strike in modern history.
Well, we have political commentator Portia Berry-Kilby here to discuss with us. Portia, this is, the headline that has really grabbed us this morning on the Sunday Telegraph. Tories in threat to torpedo unions. It really does evoke Thatcher versus the unions in the 1980s, doesn't it? How much power do unions have in this country, and do we need to take some sort of control?
I think at this point in time, unions have far too much power. When they were initially created and set up, the conditions of work were far worse than they are today. And there's a clear point for their existence back then to lobby the government for fair conditions. But at this point, no one's really working in awful conditions. They have a fair wage. And should the government really be held to ransom over a few pounds more or a slight pay rise? No. So Grant Shapps, by saying that there will not be kind of all power to the unions, is making a stand and saying that things have to change, and unions, all very well and good, can represent to some extent, but also can't kind of hold a gun to the government's head to get what they want.
Portia, aren't unions necessary? Because if you're unhappy at work, and if enough of you are unhappy at work and the management doesn't listen to you, then you need to have some sort of representation to put to the management, and if you have to, then you need to go on strike.
Well, I think we need to have strike as the last resort, not the first resort. And increasingly, it seems that it's the first resort. And I think in this particular instance with the rail networks, this comes at a time when everyone's facing a cost of living crisis. People have had their wages frozen. They are not unique in this circumstance. And by creating even more complications to people's commute to work, it might threaten other people's ability to earn money. It doesn't really seem the most sensible or even the most compassionate of decisions to take a strike at this point when they've not exhausted other avenues.
And we are, coming out of a pandemic, and the rails are pretty much on life support, aren't they, financially? It's a really difficult time to try and recover.
That's very true. And I think when you consider how much money has been pumped in to various sectors through the furlough scheme and through various other forms of help during COVID, is this really the time to be asking for more money? Of course it helps, and there's huge financial burdens on people in the wake of COVID. But making basically a standstill across the country isn't really the solution, or it shouldn't be the first port of opportunity, like the first way that people react.
I mean, the unions would say that they've raised this already with the government before, and the government's not listening, and so that's why they're having to ballot on strike action. Now, if this legislation were to be passed where there are a minimum number of rail workers required, otherwise the strike is deemed illegal, surely that would completely defeat the whole point of having a strike.
Well, I think there's obviously going to be some impact if you have a strike, even of some people, and it will mean that people might not be able to take the train for leisure purposes, even for work purposes. But thankfully, for many jobs, you can work from home. There will still obviously be some impacted. But why should a rail strike lead to food shortages? There's got to be some provision in place so that normal life for everyone else can go on. They're striking against their own sector, not against the whole country. So why should everyone suffer?
Portia, we also wanted to touch on this other story on the front of the Sunday Express this morning. It's the free tuition pledge for all pupils, Nadeem Zahawi's pledge here. What's changed? Because there was already something in place, wasn't it, for this?
Yes, so this basically allows pupils to catch up with certain basic skills like reading, writing, math, and this was put in place in the wake of COVID to make sure that students who were behind in school had better support. Now this will be made permanent. This is apparently going to be paid for by the pupil premium, which historically was to help people from lower financial, socioeconomic backgrounds. But now this will be to help any state school pupil who isn't performing where they should. And it also gives parents the right to ask schools, what are you doing for my child who is underperforming? And this parental pledge to get answers from schools, which seems a very fair provision, and about time that parents do know exactly what's going on in their child's schooling.
Do we know what teachers are making of this?
Well, I think it kind of puts an extra burden on the teachers once again, and often these things do. There's going to be more angry parents asking what their child is doing, and once again, it won't be the child who's in the wrong. It never is in these circumstances. It's always the teacher who isn't doing enough. But of course, there is provision here. There is some funding for it. And for the teacher to be able to say, I'm actually doing nothing for your child, that is wrong. And the teacher's job is to get children up to an adequate level of learning. So yes, I think teachers are always hesitant to new ideas that come in because often it will mean more work for them or more accountability, but that's not always a bad thing.
Well, so that politically it sounds great, but then you need to drill into the detail really to understand whether it can actually happen and find out, both sides of the story. We wanted to get your reaction as well to events in Australia. In the last 24 hours, they now have a new Prime Minister. The left-wing Labour Party are now in charge. Anthony Albanese, Australia's first Anglo-Italian Prime Minister. I was just wondering what you made of that and what the implications could be for the UK.
Well, I think it shows a shifting tide of opinion. I think in the wake of COVID, all governments have somewhat surrendered any commitment to independence and liberty. And naturally, it's about time that those parties which had historically been advocating for greater personal freedoms are voted out when they've shirked all of these responsibilities the past 2 years. This is very much what we're seeing in Australia with the Labour Party coming in, which isn't quite as pro-personal choice, shall we say, as typically like more conservative parties and their predecessors. Will this mean the same for the UK in a couple of years? Very perhaps. I think there is a shift away from conservatism generally, especially, or not necessarily to Labour, but it's more if your party in power has shirked their responsibilities and kind of the principles that underpin them and their governance, then it's only natural that people will vote for another party.
So tell us what we know about Anthony Albanese. What can we expect from him in the first few months in office?
So he's made a very much a firm commitment to tackling climate change, as he's described it, climate wars. They matched the incumbents' commitment to 2050 net zero, but there was kind of a growing consensus that that wasn't quite enough and that the former party weren't doing enough to meet that target. So that seems to be his primary focus on that, and continued support in terms of public spending. He seems very much a guy who is from a more working class background. He was raised by a single mother. So, he's got the typical story of a Labour politician and, is putting climate at the forefront of people's minds and of his political agenda.
Really appreciate your time this morning, Portia. Thank you so much for speaking to us. That is Portia Berry-Kilby, political commentator with Young Voices UK. And it'll be really interesting to see how Australia develops over the next few years with Anthony Albanese in charge. He does have a long... Portia there was alluding to his background, but he does have a long political career. He's a former Deputy Prime Minister under Kevin Rudd in 2013, and he only became his party's leader in 2019. So he does have a long, distinguished political career behind him as well. But it'd be interesting to see the direction the country heads in, certainly becoming a lot more pro-climate change. Do let us know your thoughts on that, GB Views at gbnews.uk.